Welcome to a webinar with the Norwegian ME Association. We have been so lucky tonight that we got Diane O'Leary to speak to us. I think before your presentation, a new perspective on better care for ME-CFS, you might just start by telling us a bit about yourself.
Sure. Hi there. Nice to see you. Thanks everybody for coming. I am a philosopher, which sounds surprising for somebody working in medicine. I do philosophy of medicine, but my research focuses on the overlap between philosophy of medicine and philosophy of mind, so the mind-body issues, and bioethics. So I'm writing a book about gaslighting, also writing a book about dualism in medicine, and a lot of my research focuses on confusions in medicine about mind and body, particularly in women, with medicine's tendency to attribute women's symptoms to the mind, to the psyche, rather than to the body. One thing I might say is that I'm an independent researcher, so I'm a full professor part-time. And the reason for that is that I have a chronic illness, so I'm disabled. And the reason that I raised that is two reasons, really. First, just to point out to anybody who might wonder that disabled people, disabled women can do research, can have an impact in medicine, in any field, even if you're working from home, even if you're ill. And second, just to tell you a happy success story, I was severely ill for many years. I don't have ME, I have a rare disease. And I spent 12 years being housebound and mostly bedbound, and thought there was absolutely no hope. And yet here I am. So I won't talk anything about my personal life or my own health. I do not have ME, but just to give you some sense of the context for the stuff that I do.
Okay, so thank you, Diane. We're ready for you.
All righty, I'll just share my screen. Okay, so we all set?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about a new perspective on better care for ME-CFS. And the talk will really have just three parts. First, I'm going to address the question of how does medicine handle ME differently from the way that it handles other conditions. In part two, I'm going to look into why this is happening, why medicine handles ME differently in these ways. And then at the end, I'm going to focus all of this on Norway to try and sort out how this information might help to improve care for ME in Norway. So in part one here, we're looking at the problem that medicine handles ME differently from the way that it handles other conditions. And I think that the way that people often express this, patients and advocates, is to say, this is not how medicine is supposed to work. And there's a lot of wisdom in that. That is certainly true. So what I'm suggesting here is that we should try and sort out the difference between the way ME is handled and the way other conditions are handled, so that we can understand how to address the problem in the most effective way. To do that, I'm going to kind of zoom out and look at the really big picture of medicine, see what we're trying to do. Obviously, medicine's goal is to improve and protect health, and to do that without causing harm, obviously, with minimal harm. The success or failure of medicine happens at the level of medical practice. So medicine succeeds or fails at the level where individual doctors make decisions about individual patients. So that is always the bottom line with medicine. That's the goal, is to make that level of medicine succeed. And the way that we do that, obviously, is science. All of medical practice needs to be driven by scientific research. Oops, wrong way. This generally will lead us to a picture where we think, okay, there's science in original research, then there's the stuff that doctors do, and success in medical science is when doctors apply research. If that's the view that we have, we're inclined to think that when medical science fails, it's just a matter of the connection between doctors and research, or the research has failed, or the doctors have failed. But really the picture of what medical science is and how it works is a whole lot more complicated than that. Medical science actually has several distinct layers. So there is original research, there's also medical education, and there's health policy. And all three of these layers work together in order to make medical practice scientific. What I'm going to do today is kind of different from what I normally do, or what people normally do when they talk about improving ME care. I'm really going to pretty much ignore the idea of doctors and what doctors do and shouldn't do. What I'm going to suggest is that because doctors' success or failure depends on what goes on scientifically at these other levels, maybe the best approach is to think about how ME is handled at these other levels so that we can improve that problem in a way that's going to improve medical practice. Science-based patient care is made possible when practice is scientific, at all three of these levels. So need to have science going on at the level of research, and science at the level of medical education, and science at the level of health policy in order for medical practice to succeed in a scientific way. What I'm going to do then is to walk through these three different levels of science in general, and then we're going to consider how ME is handled differently at each of these three levels. So at the level of scientific research, obviously, original research is the foundation for medicine. So studies need to be performed according to strict standards for rigor and objectivity. But it's really not just a matter of individual scientists or teams arriving at individual findings and putting out a gazillion individual findings, right? The way science works mostly is that individual findings are considered together in new science, so competing ideas are compared and evaluated in a rigorous scientific way. So scientific research has to succeed at both of these ways, not just putting out findings, but also comparing findings in a scientific way. At the level of education, obviously medical care has to be based on science, but that doesn't mean that every doctor goes and reads every study, right? Findings from research are digested and interpreted and organized by medical educators, and they can't do that in a random way or in a way that's based on opinion, but that process of interpreting and digesting medical research has to proceed in a scientific way, in a rigorous, objective fashion. And that allows medical research to be processed into forms that work for medical education and continuing education. At the level of health policy, national policymakers and international policymakers, particularly in coding, also have to base their work on science. So policymakers also need to interpret and digest and organize original research and also medical education and form that into policy standards in a rigorous scientific way. I should mention that really medical education and health policy really interact in both directions. In any case, a really good example of what health policy aims to do is the motto of the National Institutes of Health in the US. This is the primary medical research institute in the US, and their motto is turning discovery into health. So the idea is not just we put out a lot of findings and a lot of scientific reviews and comparisons of evidence. The idea is that we actually take the scientific discoveries and interpret them and digest them and turn them into education and policy that will allow actual individual doctors to make the best possible use of them. So what we want to ask then is what is unique about the way that medicine handles ME at each of these levels of medical science? We might think that the trouble with ME, the reason it's handled differently, is because there is so much uncertainty in the science about the nature of the disease, the diagnostic criteria, the treatment. And we might think that the difficulty with ME, the reason it's handled differently, is because there isn't one model for understanding it. There are two. The psychosomatic model. Psychosomatic just means mind, body. So this is the long-standing model where ME is understood to be caused by psychological troubles or faulty illness beliefs. This model has dominated research and practice since the 1980s. But then the biological model emerged in the last 10 years as an alternative to the status quo. So at this point, there are competing models in the scientific research. And we might think, well, maybe that's the reason why ME is handled differently, because this is a challenge for science when you have competing models. In reality, no, that cannot be the source of the trouble, because medical science has very refined tools for handling uncertainty in a scientific way. At the levels of research and education and policy, there are very well-established practices that ensure that competing models are handled in an objective and rigorous way. So really, competing models don't interfere with medical science. Competing models are really what drives medical science. You know, the effort to continually reassess and reevaluate different ideas in a way that can lead to the best patient care. So let's look, before we look at ME, at some really similar challenges that medical science has faced. There were competing models for the understanding of peptic ulcer, where the original model said peptic ulcer is caused by stress and by lifestyle. And that original model was one that medicine had invested in deeply. So there are professorships and there's infrastructure in medicine. There are textbooks. There are whole departments, whole careers that are invested in the model of peptic ulcer being caused by lifestyle and stress. And then these two fellows from Australia come along and start publishing research that says, no, it's actually not that. It's caused by a bacteria. So originally, there's a great deal of resistance to that idea, as there has been to the biological model of ME. So development is very slow, but ultimately a very successful and convincing study is published on the competing model, and the model with the stronger evidence prevails. Education then recognizes the comparison and responds by revising the curriculum, and then policy recognizes the comparison and adjusts in a way that reflects the new model. So these are the two fellows toasting because they won the Nobel Prize actually for that effort. Another similar challenge in medical science is HIV/AIDS, because it was a condition where social bias was interfering with science, as it certainly does with ME, and I'm going to talk about that in a bit. You see this banner there from campaigning for AIDS research about hysteria. So there's an irony there, because that's really going to be the focus of what I'm talking about in part 2. So with HIV/AIDS, research is obviously slowed by social bias to the point where tragically millions of lives are lost that didn't need to be lost. So the research process is very slow because of social bias, but ultimately a lot of different models for understanding the disease are published in research. Research is done that evaluates the merits of all of the competing ideas, and through that process, the right model for understanding HIV/AIDS emerges as a consensus. That's how science is supposed to work. Then scientifically, at the level of education, those findings are organized into new curriculum. And then at the policy level, the research and the medical education are processed into guidelines and coding. So let's look now at what happens with ME at each of these three levels of science, because this is where things go wrong, I think. In terms of research for ME, for decades, as you all know, research focused on the psychosomatic model, on the model of psychological causes or faulty illness beliefs, but original science has done its job. There is new biological research now, particularly since long COVID, and it has provided a viable alternative to the longstanding psychosomatic model. So that is a success in terms of individual findings. However, researchers have failed to pursue scientific evaluations of the two models within the same frame. So we have good science on the biology of ME, and we have a lot of science on the psychosomatic model of ME. We don't have any science that compares the two models and tries to decide which one is best. For some reason, researchers who work on the biology of ME ignore the psychosomatic model. They never attempt to show that their model is better. And the folks who work on the psychosomatic model never talk about the biological model, never attempt to show that what they're doing is better. So these two models remain separate in science. And that is a very bizarre situation. When it comes to medical education on ME, scientific medical practice comes from medical education that processes research in a rigorous scientific way. As a matter of fact, and this is not debatable, the psychosomatic model no longer dominates in scientific research, but education has not adjusted to reflect the two competing models. So I'm not asking that education should now say, okay, the problem is biological, but certainly at this point, education should reflect the fact that there's not one way of looking at ME, there are two, and they are at least equally well supported in the science. Education has not done that. They're continuing to focus on the psychosomatic model as if the biological research isn't there. So with ME, medical education has failed to perform its usual practice of processing scientific research in a scientific way. When it comes to health policy on ME, there has been really astonishing progress thanks to the very hard work and intelligence and heart of ME patients and advocates. There have been major recent changes in global health policy on ME. What's happened is that health policymakers recognize that research has failed to perform comparative studies that evaluate the merits of the two models and try to determine which one is better. And so health policymakers have performed these comparisons themselves in a rigorous scientific way. And this is a great success. This is exactly what scientific health policy does. They digest research and medical education in a rigorous scientific way so we can sort out what to actually do with it. In 2014, launching a major shift in ME care, the NIH published Pathways to Prevention, where they had enlisted an independent organization to do a rigorous review of the scientific evidence for the biological model and the psychosocial model. Then they convened a panel with a bunch of medical professionals and patients to consider the findings. And they published this in Pathways to Prevention. And they say, for the first time, we have made a terrible error. The psychosomatic model for ME is not supported by science. It was a medical error. And instead, ME is a disease, and we have to address it through biological science. This launches an enormous series of changes. The following year, the US National Academy of Sciences publishes its own comparative evaluation of evidence. And I think it's hard for people to recognize this, but really there are very few voices in all of healthcare in all the world that have more authority than the Institute of Medicine that published this this evidence review. It's part of the National Academy of Sciences in the US. And the fact that they sided with the biological side is probably just, it is the most authoritative voice that you could find on any issue in medicine across the globe. In 2016, the AHRQ in the US publishes another comparative evaluation. In 2018, policymakers in the Netherlands published one. 2020, Belgium does their own. In 2021, the NICE guideline in the UK is finally published, again, aligning with the Institute of Medicine in the US. There have been two since these, one by the CDC, one in Germany. So that's, I think, 8 distinct, scientific, rigorous comparisons of the evidence on both sides. All of these conclude that the biological model is far better supported by science. So overall, health policy in countries with guidelines based on rigorous evaluations of competing models, ME policy is scientific. In countries where guidelines are not based on rigorous evaluations of the competing models, ME policy is not scientific. In Norway, we've got a very unusual circumstance where the guideline aims to be entirely neutral. In politics, neutrality is important because it allows us to have an equal airing of opposed positions, but medicine doesn't work that way. If it's possible you have either heartburn or a heart attack, the doctor doesn't go, well, it's 50-50, let's hear both sides, right? Instead, she pursues a rigorous evaluation of your symptoms and the science that supports them in order to sort out which of those is best supported by science, because that's the only way to help you be well. Science is the only way that medicine can achieve neutrality. This is just taken from the Recovery Norway site. You know, obviously a very wonderful thing when anybody recovers from ME. But what's happening at this site is really just anecdotal evidence, just patients talking about themselves. And that's really just popular ideas. Anecdotal evidence is obviously not science. But when policymakers fail to provide scientific guidance on any condition, popular ideas will seep in and fill in the gap. There's a reason why medical research is filtered by scientific peer review rather than by marketing and anecdotal patient stories. And the reason for that is that popular opinion cannot determine the best way to help people be healthy. So to review, we're asking how medical science handles ME differently at all 3 of these levels. First, in a global sense, research is divided into 2 camps. There's been no scientific effort to compare the merits of the 2 models, not at the level of research. That is bizarre. Secondly, at the level of education, educators have failed to objectively process ME research for medical training in a scientific way. And finally, specifically in Norway, ME policy is aiming for political neutrality rather than the scientific neutrality that medicine usually achieves with scientific review of evidence. So let's consider now the second question: why has this happened? Why are researchers, educators, and policymakers comfortable abandoning scientific standards when it comes to ME? On this score, really, it's not science that we need to look to, but human rights and ethics. Medicine is committed to what's known as the principle of justice. Basically, every person has an equal right to healthcare. Actually, unless you're American, where there is no right to healthcare, but we'll ignore that for today. In Europe, every person has an equal right to healthcare. And specifically for ME, what's most important there is that medicine must not favor or disfavor any particular condition. So no matter what condition you have an equal right to healthcare. And medicine must not favor or disfavor any social identity. On both counts, the principle of justice has failed in the case of ME. First, there's widespread professional resistance to working on ME. This is very well known in all of the medical professions, but there's been no effort in research, education, or policy to ensure that this general bias and distaste for the condition of ME, I think honestly it's fear more than anything else, never interferes with scientific standards. I think that bias against the condition of ME is actually related to gender bias. Second, ME is really the paradigm for gender bias in medicine. So the best explanation for the compromise in science is the historical connection between ME and female hysteria. In the 1970s, the women's liberation movement gave women the right to make their own medical decisions for the first time. Prior to that time, husbands, fathers, brothers could make medical decisions for women. But right around the 70s, that was no longer true. Liberated women were just not willing to tolerate diagnosis of hysteria anymore. In 1980, the Psychiatric Diagnostic Manual drops the construct of hysteria, but that change did not occur because they were concerned about misdiagnosis, and it did not occur because they were aware that it's unjust to stereotype women as over-emotional or incapable of understanding their bodily sensations. Hysteria was actually not abandoned. It was just renamed so that women will not recognize it and object to the care that doctors think they need. So this is a very disturbing quote from a very prominent textbook in 2004. It says, hysteria, we're often told, is an old-fashioned term for a disorder that has disappeared. Certainly the term is old-fashioned. It's been ingrained in medicine for 2,000 years, but hysteria has not disappeared. Hysteria was renamed by committee, and it now masquerades under new terms. So this is a textbook, a very prominent psychiatric textbook. So what you're seeing here is really just a confession that the medicine did not abandon hysteria. They just renamed it for deceptive purposes. So medicine became aware of ME-CFS as ME and CFS in the 1980s, right around the time that hysteria was renamed for deceptive purposes. Right around that time, the field of psychosomatic medicine, that's an area of psychiatry, was becoming mainstream, and their primary goal was to develop techniques that help doctors deal with hysterical women. ME-CFS appears right at that moment and becomes the standard bearer for psychosomatic medicine's new approach to hysteria. And at that time, ME-CFS is openly equated with hysteria without any reservation. And really that has gone into the 90s and 2000s. Excuse me. So this puts us in a position to answer the question, why are researchers, educators, and policymakers comfortable abandoning scientific standards when it comes to ME? Why aren't they concerned about the potential harms that result when patient care is not driven by science? The ugly truth on this is it's because ME-CFS has been equated with hysteria from the beginning in medicine. Hysteria doesn't pose any medical risk, and medical science is not needed to manage hysteria. So it's not that medical professionals think, geez, what is ME? We could do science on it. Nah, let's not. The question never arises. The word ME, the word CFS, they don't have a lot of training on that, so they really just equate it with hysteria in a very rough and ready way. And they figure, oh, that's hysteria. ME, that means hysteria. You don't need any science for that. This is very disturbing, right? I find this truth extremely disturbing. The thing that you need to do when you're disturbed by this is to ask, what is wrong with it? Why is it a problem for medicine to proceed this way? And the reason is a point of justice. because every person has the same right to healthcare. When you manage ME unscientifically, you violate the human right, the equal right to healthcare. When you allow bias against a condition to interfere with scientific practice, that is a violation of human rights. And in every case where a medical professional sets science aside on the basis of gender, that is a violation of human rights. So let's think about how this information might help change things in Norway. The question that we're dealing with to review is, how does medicine handle ME differently from the way it handles other conditions? The research is divided. Education doesn't process the two sides of research. And in Norway, policy is aiming for political neutrality rather than scientific review of the evidence. In a nutshell, the problem is a breakdown in the scientific processes that transform research into medical education and policy. So the problem is really not in what doctors do. The problem is in the way that medicine handles scientific research in order to inform the doctors. The breakdown in the scientific process has occurred because ME has been equated with hysteria from the start. Hysteria doesn't pose a medical risk. Medical science is not needed to manage hysteria. The reason that this is a problem is that a breakdown in medical science for a disfavored condition in a disfavored social group is a straightforward violation of human rights, the equal right to healthcare. So on this basis, I can give it my best shot to offer some advice for how you might try to improve things with ME care in Norway. And let me just say right off the bat, I'm just doing my best to offer some things that might help. If some of it's helpful, use it. If none of it's helpful, don't use it. The first point that I would make here is that at this point, at least, let medical authorities do the talking on medical science. This is really difficult because people in the ME community are extraordinarily well informed about science on the condition. So science on the psychosomatic side and what's wrong with it, and new biological science. And so there's this need to, there's a feeling that you need to inform doctors, policymakers, the general public about all these scientific ideas that you understand so well, that you actually understand better than the doctors and the policymakers. In reality, that approach is really not likely to be helpful, not anymore, because at this point, you have these 8 very authoritative medical voices who have processed the medical science for you. So instead of bringing science directly to the policymakers and the people who can make change, bring the scientific reviews of evidence to them, because they cannot ignore those voices. Those voices have far more authority than health policymakers in Norway have. And those voices are unequivocal. The science there is entirely clear, and it says what you wanted, what you needed to say. Second, and really I owe this one to my colleague, the Countess of Mar, who I've worked with quite a lot on ME. Really her goal, her effort to get the ME guideline in the UK changed was based on this principle. The goal, what you want to do is articulate clear goals to the policymakers, but goals that can be accomplished without them having to admit that they made a mistake. So what you want to do is to make it easy for them to change rather than hard. You want them to be able to feel good when they make the change, rather than saying, oh, no, we've been so wrong, we're so sorry, because that's never going to happen, right? So you have to find a way of phrasing things in the changes that you want that will make them feel positive and good about proceeding on the path that you want them to go down. And third, emphasize every patient's equal right to science-driven healthcare. And really, this is a shift. It's an equal rights, it's a human rights perspective. So I think the primary message that you're aiming for is this, that current ME-CFS policy is unscientific in Norway and unjust. Importantly, this message does not express a preference on the science one way or another. It just says, what you're doing is unscientific. Please do science. Instead, you're just asking for the scientific standards that are usually expected in research, in education, in policy, and ultimately in practice. Now, at this point, if you had asked just do science 10 years ago, you would end up with a whole lot of psychosomatic science, a whole lot of science in psychiatry. That's not the case anymore. If your point now is please do science, the science that's available is now unequivocal. You now have these 8 scientific reviews of the evidence that unequivocally, unanimously, and independently support biological science for ME. It's really not going to be possible for anybody to scientifically support the old model over the new one. Also, this message that current care ME policy is unscientific and unjust, it highlights the idea of gender injustice in healthcare. Importantly, you're not accusing anybody of being unjust, because even though there might be good reason for these kinds of accusations, those kinds of accusations are not going to help you accomplish the goal. The goal in raising this issue is to align discussion of ME with discussion of gender health equity, which is a focal concern for the World Health Organization and for human rights organizations in general. So the conversation about ME can shift to a conversation of gender justice in medicine, because there is just so much effort and concern about that right now, particularly in Europe. So as I see it, I think 3 core changes are needed. First, and most importantly, you're looking to get a guideline that's based on rigorous scientific evaluation of the merits of competing models. So this is not, hey, make a new guideline with the science that we prefer, right? Because that's never going to speak to them. Instead, this is an objective, neutral, very collaborative request that focuses on science and respects science. You're not asking for a particular view, you're just asking for science. Second, you want oversight of medical education to ensure that doctors' training will reflect the current state of the science. And again, you're not saying train the doctors with the science we prefer. You're just saying train the doctors with a scientific picture of what the research says. When they do that, they will have to bring both models into medical training, and they will have to acknowledge that unequivocally science supports one model over the other. And finally, you're looking for authoritative communications that remind doctors of their commitment to science over marketing and popular opinion. So this is not silence the view that we oppose. This is, again, remind doctors of the importance of science over popular opinion when it comes to patient care. It is the job of health policymakers to warn the public and the medical profession about health claims that have not been vetted by scientific peer review. So this is an ad from the website of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Watch out for quick fix, all natural miracle cure claims, exactly like the kind that you're seeing in the psychosomatic model for ME in Norway at this time. Okay, that's it for me. I just want to say that I do believe that change is underway for ME patients. I think most people can see that now. I believe that in the next 10 years, the struggles that you're having to improve care for ME and the successes that you will certainly have will be the stuff of legend, because we will soon be in a time when these struggles are a thing of the past. All right, that's it for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Diane, for a bit of a disturbing but very useful talk. I think most of us now have loads of ideas of how we're gonna make the future bright. We have one comment, but I'm so far. So everyone, if you have questions, just bring them out now. And I would like to start with a question, because lately when ME patients point out inequities in treatment, diagnosis, care and social services, they are met with it's so important to hope. It's like they almost say that the reason they come with unsubstantiated claims about that people will any day now be well, when it's not the case, for instance, that this is the reason. And normally in Norwegian, at least medicine, they're very much concerned with informed consent, and that people need to know the truth, which is like an ethical standard. Why is this suddenly not important when the patient has ME?
Wow, it's a really just so terrific how you phrased that question. This campaign about focusing on hope arises from a boatload of research in psychiatry in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, where psychiatrists proposed that the way to treat ME is by saying certain things. So the idea is that this is hysteria. There's nothing wrong with these women. And so the way that you fix the condition is just by getting them to understand that there's nothing wrong with them, giving them hope. Somehow they describe this as validating the patient. And, you know, that's been the tradition for 30 years. This idea of giving hope to patients is really just a very practical manifestation of the psychosomatic model. It's been going on for a long time. But you're exactly right about the reason why it's a problem. And it's because every patient has a right to informed consent. You can't consent to your medical care if you're not fully informed about your diagnosis and your prognosis, and the treatments that are available and how they succeed and how they fail. So yeah, this is a direct violation of the right to informed consent for patients. And I think that people get taken with the idea of being kind toward patients. And so they think it's an act of kindness to promote hope. But really the message that you want to hammer there, and it is exactly as you phrased it, is that if you don't tell the truth, you deny patients' fundamental human rights to informed consent. And when you do that, that is not hopeful. You fail to respect the patient's right to make their own decisions about their care. And that is not hopeful. That is a demeaning violation of basic ethical principles.
I'm just gonna keep on with the questions here. We have one here. Thank you, Diane. Can you give some advice on how to handle authorities that ignore patient voices?
I'm not sure whether you mean like authorities in health policy or whether you mean individual doctors.
I think it's more, I guess, the broader perspective here.
I think that at this point, I guess I would, my advice on this would be very different now than it would have been 10 years ago. 10 years ago, patient voices on ME were entirely ignored. But this has really changed. These 8 reviews of evidence that we now have from all these different governments really arose because they listened to patient voices, and patients were deeply involved in these processes a lot of the time. So at this point, the patient's voices have been heard in a way that's changing things. I think at this point, the best way to get the patients heard is to stop asking for the patients to be heard and instead ask for the science to be heard. What you need at this point, the message you want to send at this point is not, hey, listen to us. Hey, we matter. The message that's certainly true. They should listen to you. You do matter. But the message that will help you accomplish the goal is listen to the science. Look at the evidence reviews performed by the most authoritative voices in medicine. Respond to those. Because that's what you need. That's the way that you're going to get the doctors to give you the care that you need.
Thank you. Can any of those 8 reviews you mentioned be considered international? Maybe some nations will disregard some of them because they're from a different country. Is there an international standard for which reviews to consider?
Yeah, that's a really good question. An authority like the Institute of Medicine in the US, that institute is part of the National Academy of Sciences in the US, and normally their conclusions are globally adopted. So, their conclusions on diagnostic error, for example, change the way that the whole world handles diagnostic error. So when they do a study of the science, their conclusions are always impactful across the globe. And really, there are no higher authorities than that aside from coding. But people who do coding at the global level really can't perform the kinds of studies that you would need to evaluate the evidence. But it's not the case that health policy for one country only pertains to that country. Every one of these scientific reviews of evidence considers evidence from all around the world. I think I'm not sure, is it the IOM one or the NIH one, they considered 6,000 research studies on ME. And these are from all around the world. Science really doesn't have national borders in that way. So every single one of these is an international global evaluation. And there's really no sense in which any of these specifically pertain to one country.
How do you think we'll look at today's and the last decade's harmful treatment and our general view of ME in 100 years?
I like to think that really in less than 100 years, one of the things I've written in the book I'm working on is that high school students will read in a routine way about medicine at this time and the harm that it does to women, where women's diseases are so often ignored and neglected, and women's reports about their health are routinely set aside in ways that ruin lives and end lives. So I think that ME will be the paradigm for this problem. ME is what this problem looks like in the clearest possible form. So people will see how ME patients struggled during this time, how ME patients got new science to be performed, how got the policy changed, got the practice changed. I really think ME and ME advocacy is the key to, improving bias against women in medicine in general.
And here's, I think, in Norwegian we call it a heartfelt sigh, I guess. The research on LP lightning process is not based on objective or science, and that is the kind of research Norway funds. I'm wondering, you talked about the need for the biopsychosocial model and the biomedical model to be evaluated in the same framework.
Yeah.
Who do you think should do that evaluation? What we have seen so far is that the biopsychosocial, those who try, are maybe not entirely fair in the way they do the science on the biomedical side. It's more to win than to give an unbiased biased view. And what we've also seen, I think you're right in the way that the popular opinion is slowly changing, and that's going to help us with getting, as you say, the authoritative voices to be raised, because the problem often has been that they have been careful, and with good reason, because they have been hounded quite a lot, those few who have raised their voices before. And I think that's also a reason that many of the biomedical researchers, they just really try to do their thing and stay very clear from trying to disprove the other. They just want to find the explanation so that they can be just finished with that other point of view. But how who then is left to do that evaluation, unbiased evaluation? Yeah,
I mean, you're right. Really, the trouble is that, there are all these terrific researchers working on the biology of ME at this point, but bizarrely, they don't consider the biopsychosocial alternative. They don't show people why that alternative fails and the one that they're doing succeeds. That is a catastrophic problem. I'm not sure really what is the nature of that problem, but that is a bizarre phenomenon in medical research. But really, the question you're asking, like about the lightning process, and the fact that Norway continues to fund the lightning process, really, it's really just a matter of honing in on why that's a problem. The reason that it's a problem is that there do exist objective reviews, scientific reviews of the evidence for the lightning process and for the biopsychosocial model in comparison to the evidence for the biological disease model of ME. There exist 8 of those comparisons, and they are enormous. One of them 300 pages long. They are extremely rigorous and detailed. And the one in the UK considers the lightning process, looks at all the science for the lightning process, and says, this is terrible. No one should ever use the lightning process, right? So their determinations on that are not, here's what works for the UK. These are an objective scientific evaluation of the science that supports the lightning process. So what you want to say to the funders is, and to the people who see the lightning process being talked about so much in the context of ME, is where is the science? So the point isn't, hey, I don't like that view. And the point isn't, hey, I think the science on the other side is better, because nobody's going to listen to that. The point is, the science has been determined to be faulty by others, by people who are scientists. And it's a violation of human rights to allow any scientific approach to dominate patient care that's not actually supported by research.
That's a great answer. Very enlightening. A quick practical question here. Could you please repeat the 2 last reviews? Do you remember what the 2 last reviews were?
You mean the 2 that weren't on my slide, that I should have put on my slide? Well, there, you begin with the NIH, and the one that I think I finished with there on the slide is the UK's NICE guideline, which, there's so much struggle involved in that, because the UK is really the conceptual home of the psychosomatic approach to ME. So changing that one really just was such an enormous task. After that, you got a change in the CDC in 2022. The US CDC has been the most reluctant to adopt a biological approach to ME. And even still, they won't use the word disease, but at least they have rejected CBT and GET now. And then after that, Germany, I think, has now adopted a guideline that, again, for the 8th time, reviews the evidence and sides with the biological side. I think there are actually more. Those are the ones I know about, but I think there are actually more than 8.
Do you think lobbying done by patients, according to the methods you suggested is a way to go?
Yeah. I think that, I mean, you know your country better. You know the challenges that you face. I'm not in a position to really understand the obstacles that you're dealing with and the things that you've done and the things that you hope to do. But yeah, I would say that if you shift your focus to the science, they cannot ignore you. They can ignore your views. They cannot ignore the views of the US National Academy of Sciences. So yeah, I would shift in focus to the science. I would shift from a do the view that we like, admit you were wrong, because they're never going to do that, to hey, can we just do the science? And then they can say, look, we did science. They can feel really good about themselves, and that's what you want to do. But also, yeah, I would really emphasize the fact that the status quo, because ME patients' care is not driven by science, they're not actually receiving health care to the standard that other people receive it. And that is a violation of human rights. It's based on gender. And that message frightens them. To say, well, you don't have the scientific view I like, or even you're not listening to patient voices, okay, maybe I'll listen to you, maybe I won't. They don't feel compelled to act on that. But if you say first, you're ignoring the science as the world understands it. You're behind the world in science. This they have to listen to. And when you say you are acting unjustly, you are committing a social injustice, you are violating ethical principles, this is very scary for policymakers. No country, no national health organization is going to be willing to say, yeah, we're unethical, we're okay with that, right? That's never going to happen, right? So these are the messages that that I think will compel them to change.
One here, one more. 1.5 years ago, the Norwegian Health Directorate said they will consider updating the guideline towards the situation in Norway, as if ME is one thing in Norway and another thing elsewhere. How would you respond to that?
Can you say that again? Let me try and understand.
1.5 years ago, the Norwegian Health Directorate, Department of Health, said they will consider updating the guideline towards the situation in Norway, they call it, as if ME is one thing in Norway and another thing elsewhere. How would you respond to that?
That's very tricky. That's kind of a rhetorical trick on their part. Because obviously everything that health policy does in Norway, they have to do for Norway. So nobody's going to object to that. Yes, we need right ME care for Norway. In reality, no science is national, right? Science doesn't have national boundaries. So finding the right approach to ME can never be based on one country's views or one country's perspectives. Because, going back to the very beginning of the talk, the way that medicine works is that medicine is driven by science. Medicine doesn't work if medicine isn't driven by science. And science has no national boundaries, right? So if you make a guideline for any country that's based only on the evidence and concerns of that country, you will ignore science. Science is never restricted to one place. All scientists find objective findings that apply to all human beings who exist, right? It's never this is the problem with cancer for Americans, or this is the problem with backache, for Norwegians. It's always, this is what science says about cancer. This is what science says about backache. So maybe the pushback there would be, sure, update the guidance for Norway, but your job is to do science on science, and science is not Norwegian. I'm not sure how to get them to listen to that message, but telling them that they're unscientific shames them. Right?
I think that sounds like a very good approach. I guess you already thought about it, but 1.5 years ago was obviously when the UK NICE guidelines were updated, and probably a call for an update in those in that vein was the reason that they didn't want to promise that a new guideline would look like the British one.
Well, I mean, sorry to interrupt. I mean, their task, whatever else they want to do, they have a duty. Their job description is to proceed scientifically in digesting all the research that's out there. That's their role as health policymakers. Their role is not, what do the Norwegians think? Because that's, that's personal opinion. That's not science.
Actually, we hear that a lot, and it's often framed like it's for the patients, because the patients need to be happy. So they both sort of excuse themselves for not following the science, but also implies that the reason they're not is that the patients doesn't want science. So they also imply actually that obviously the science is on the other side.
Yes.
Without saying it straight.
Yes, I think the reason they're doing that is that they're very much in the grip of the scientific model that's existed for the last 30 years, because that model says ME is hysteria. The way you treat it is with the right words. So what they're saying sounds like it's objective. You want to do the right thing for the patients. You want to make the patients feel good. And, it's a good rhetorical trick, because everybody's going to be, yeah, you want to make the patients feel good. Who's going to object to that? In reality, that perspective is entirely 100% the psychosomatic perspective. Because, if you have cancer, nobody says, oh, our goal is to make you happy, and instead of doing science, we're just going to do the things that cheer you up, right? Nobody's going to do that with cancer, because if you want to make people well when they have disease, you have to use science. So the way to undercut that is to say, yeah, that's the psychosomatic model you're working with there. And, before you apply that, you have to defend it. Show me the science that supports that.
I'm gonna end this on two very nice comments here. Thank you for a good talk we're getting here, and thank you. This was very meaningful, and it's spot on in regards to the overall problem. And with that, we'll thank Diane O'Leary so much for coming to talk to us, and we will try, promise you, to use your advice to the very best of our abilities.
Thank you. And I'm happy to help if I can. Also, everyone, you can feel free to write to me with questions or comments or advice on the kind of things I work on. I'm easy to find online, dianeoleary.com. Always happy to hear from you.
That sounds great. I myself, at least, are gonna use that opportunity, definitely. So, yeah, everyone, good night. That's it from here, and yeah, we'll talk soon. Bye.
Bye.